Connor. And just, I'm not sure whether my Wi-Fi is slightly problematic at the moment because there was a few cuts, so I didn't capture everything that Connor fully said. But just in case, if I come off the screen for any reason, it might be because of just Wi-Fi connections and things like that. Welcome, really nice to be speaking to you guys. And just by way of introduction, it'd be really good if everyone could kind of sort of introduce themselves and say where they're from. I know you guys all know each other, but I don't know you guys. So it'd be really good if people could just say their name and what organization they're from. And also just to say, Connor's very kind and, said I'm going to be doing a presentation. I'm hoping that this would be more like a conversation after I've talked, because hopefully this will give an opportunity for you guys to ask any questions that you really want to ask. I think we can get into some details as well, which might be useful. I might not be able to answer everything, but hopefully this will be more of a conversation and me talking for the time. But yeah, if people could just say where they're from, who they are and where they're from, that would be fabulous. I'm going to go to Kate because Kate's the only name that I can see on the screen so far.
Okay, thanks, Derek. And morning, everybody. My name's Kate Beale, the Managing Director and founder here at an organisation called JST, which is now in its 10th year and stands for Just Straight Talk. We support people across the Black Country to improve their lives overall, and goals around empowering, helping people to feel more empowered, mentoring, advocacy and support. Have a mixture of SLAs, contracts and grants, and have about 8 current funded projects, a couple of those being grants through the lottery, more SLAs and contracts which are joint funded with ESF and lottery, ESF which will be no longer, and a local authority contract, and we receive fundraising support from yourselves. Very grateful for that, which helps pay for welfare support into the communities that we support that are going through issues and crisis around deprivation, poverty, domestic abuse, breakdowns and all sorts of homelessness and all sorts of social issues, but always been hugely grateful and a big supporter of the support that you give to us. I think my background when I worked with a national charity was running services, but also bringing in new business. So I have some experience of some, grant writing, but not brilliant. But I've always seemed to be able to get extra funding through or new contracts, grants or SLAs because of our reputation and because of the fact that we do go the extra mile and we can prove it and evidence that. But definitely could do with more support with that, how to clinch it, how to write it, be more succinct. And I've met with Connor a couple of times that has also given me some tips on that. So anything I hear today, I'm very grateful for, and I will be scribbling and taking lots of notes. So thank you, Derek.
Thanks for that, Kate. ESF and lottery, that's a lot of paperwork writing and report writing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, oh my gosh, to be honest with you, since 2016, I mean, the organisation here has grown rapidly because of ESF and lottery match projects. So one of my contracts, I've got 10 staff. The back of office stuff, in literally 2016, 17, 18 and 19, I aged 10 years in 3 because of, and I work, I'm contracted 37 hours to myself, but I've never done less than about 40 or 50 because in the early days of setting up an ESF and lottery project, for anyone that will know, every pound, shilling, penny, every tick on a T and a dot on an I, it's quite intense. On our contract for the ESF and lottery contract since 2016 to 2023, because it finishes next year, is way over £1 million, but everything is so tight. They don't give you that money and tell you to spend it and do your very level best. Everything is on a budget line. Everything needs 3 quotes for procurement. Everything has to, be apportioned, everything or not apportioned. It's incredibly watertight, the back of office administration behind that. And that comes to me, and it can sometimes be very challenging, or was in the early days. Like I said, I definitely aged, and I'm sure I blame my pneumonia in 2017 on the ESF and lottery projects, because it did push me sometimes to that point. And it's very real. I don't have departments here, I am the departments. I have the frontline staff that do an amazing job, and I'm very grateful to them for making my life easier with their participants. But the back of office stuff behind that goes with any match funded project, especially ESF, is very challenging.
Thanks, Kate. I really appreciate that, and for the honesty as well. I'm going to hand over to Lisbeth. And Lisbeth, once you've finished, you hand it over to someone else as well. Thanks.
Absolutely fine. So I'm the operations manager at Guy's Gift. We're a local charity in Coventry and Warwickshire that provide bereavement support and counselling for children and young people. Quite similar stuff to what Kate's saying, that we're a tiny team. I've got a fundraiser who would have been here today, but he doesn't work today, so I was unable to bring him in. We've got a fundraiser who's working with us 2 days a week, who is, a lot of what we do is based off what I would call is a speculative approach to trusts. We have recently had a 460,000 over 3 years lottery award, which is based on making changes to the provision that we've got in place at the moment. So I'm fully aware of everything Kate's saying there in terms of the admin that goes around, first of all, getting that, but also the processing for the duration of that grant. That grant is dependent on us sourcing funding to match up to 30% of the grant as well. So we've got I suppose it's a challenge for us now, because a lot of the project-based funding that is much easier to secure than it is the general running costs of charity. The project-based funding is less accessible to us now because the lottery is covering some of that. So we've got a real challenge to make sure we're getting funding that does match and does work how we need it to. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's us at the moment. And I think the only other person to introduce is Joanne then.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So we're in Bicester. We're a group called Forget Me Not in Bicester. So we're a friendship and lunch club for older people and for people living with dementia. About 70% of our clients are living with dementia. So what we do is we're open 2 days a week. And we provide a full day, so from 9:30 to 3 o'clock, which gives their carers a break for the day. It means people can stay living in their own homes with their families for longer because their family gets that break. We only opened 4 years ago. The 4 of us who run the company used to work for Oxfordshire County Council and in adult services, and it became very clear that the council really was going to withdraw this service because there isn't a legal obligation to provide it. So over 6 weeks we decided that we'd set up our own. So we took a massive gamble, really. At that time we'd no support. It was our ideas. Thankfully we'd got husbands who were earning money, so that, you know, we handed in our notice and all left on the same day and set up this business. We are very lucky that we have the backing of the Methodist Church, so that we rent a room from them, and they're very supportive of us for that. So it's generally me that applies for the grants. We do get now some support from the local council. Like, for instance, we didn't have any suitable chairs because, you know, older people need sturdy chairs with arms and, you know, not the cheap plastic chairs and all that. So I applied to the first grant we got was with the local town council for £3,000 for chairs. It's those kind of things and the support and recognition from the co-op that that means such a lot to us. We really do run on a shoestring. We pay ourselves a very small amount of money for doing it. We have volunteers who help us a lot, and we're very well supported by the local community. But as I say, it's me that applies for the grants. The council, again, do provide us with a small grant, which obviously I have to apply for and account for everything. So it just is really any pointers towards, you know, what makes it a little bit easier to apply for things. I think we're all saying, aren't we, really, that it's such a time-consuming business, and you don't realise how time-consuming it all is till you've thought, well, that's all my evenings this week gone on on doing that application. I think we're all in that position, really, aren't we? So yeah, so that's us.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Lisbeth and Kate. So I still, get a tingle down my spine when I hear, the work that you guys are doing and stuff. So, just before I start and everything, just huge levels and layers of respect for the work that you do, and often having to do that under hostile circumstances, be it managing massive contracts and paperwork or just applying. So I just wanted to, say a huge level of respect first and foremost. So just a little bit of background on me. As Connor said, I am the CEO of 10 Years Time, and 10 Years Time, essentially works with high net worth individuals and with trusts and foundations and funders, essentially to get them to resource more, you could say, grassroots organizations, and however you want to describe grassroots. It's a very, very wide sort of definition, but very much we are keen for more trusts and foundations and funders to be supporting organizations that are led and governed by people that are really close to the social issue that they are working on. It's often the case that the industry that is philanthropy often favors organizations that have the resource and have huge fundraising teams that are able to essentially spend what I would say is a lot of time hanging around funders. So going to the various events, doing the online events, which is what fundraisers tend to do, is hang out, find out what funders are thinking, and are very skilled at selling that back to them. And that's essentially what they do. But obviously that takes time and resource to be able to do that, and also to build the relationships. So we often spend a lot of time trying to broker relationships between funders and more grassroots organizations, so they're not relying on paperwork as the sole basis through which they're making assessment for an organization and stuff. My background, I used to deliver programs. So I used to be a youth worker many, many years ago. And then, so I was that guy 20 plus years ago with a rucksack on, going into different estates and doing evening sessions at various youth clubs and various other sessions, and then hopping on the bus and going to another youth club and delivering the programs. And like you, Kate, I ran a program called Project Subway a few years ago, which was a journalism program for young people, but really teaching employability skills through youth work, through journalism. And again, it was the ESF program, and it was one of those programs where, you had to work with, 120 kids. And if you worked with 118 kids, then you were going to be penalized for the 2 kids that you hadn't worked with in that time. I think at the time we also had to get young people to complete, I think it was an 8-page form before they could even access one of our courses and stuff like that. So these were, I don't know how much things have changed, but these were pretty much the bad old days of funding, where we pretty much spent most of our time filling out paperwork. you know, and trying to get our courses accredited, because at the time, if it wasn't accredited, it was, you know, not that it was worthless, but we couldn't get funding. And so we spent, you know, pretty much most of our daytimes doing that paperwork, and then the evenings pretty much delivering programs. And I remember I got to a point where, so I was doing Project Subway, and then I worked at the Stephen Lawrence Trust, and it was also very, very similar in terms of, you know, we're hitting all of these deadlines, but we're pretty much spending most of our time doing the paperwork. So I got interested in philanthropy around 2009 because I wanted to know how things worked, because in both cases, in both organizations, we had done independent evaluations, we'd had audits done, and, you know, we had proven through whatever metrics that were given to us that we had been successful in terms of what we were funded to do, but we often couldn't get either continuation funding or the funding terms which said, okay, we've almost killed ourselves to meet these targets. Can we have a bit of extra money to be able to deliver it, you know, to an even better quality, or scale it, or have a bit of time to be able to diversify our income? Things never worked that way. We'd get the similar terms, and all that would happen was we were delivering on another 3-year cycle, doing something similar, but really not being able to make those improvements that we really wanted to make. So I got interested in moving to the other side, which some might say was the dark side, because I really wanted to know how things worked. I really wanted to know, you know, what was going on behind the scenes. And I think what I discovered was that everything was based on relationships, and I just wasn't privy to any of those relationships. This was the main reason why you know, people were getting funding. When I went on to the other side, I'd realized that a lot of the organizations were being refunded. They knew grants officers really, really well. You know, there was an element of, even though everything seems equal because everyone's putting in the same paperwork and the forms look very much the same, the bottom line is what underpinned one organization's paperwork and made it more advantageous than another was the fact that someone knew someone in that organization that meant that things were not always that equal. So I guess for me, it was really, I remember at one point, I used to spend most of my time, I started off at Esme Fairbairn, and I very much spent most of my time doing outreach, which meant that I was getting lots of applications coming in, and most of those applications, for me, I couldn't really decide what was good from what was not good. You know, so for me, because I was a youth worker and because I worked in education and various other things, I kind of went to see programs to see what it looked like in action, and that would be very much my lens towards, you know, funding. It was not so much on whether the governance was brilliant or not. It wasn't so much on whether the financial management side of it was brilliant or not, because I felt that as a funder, we could help and support with things like, you know, financial management and governance. We can help with that. What we fundamentally couldn't help with is if the service is good or not, and that should be the basis through which we funded and stuff. So that's why I got involved, and I think, you know, sort of 13 years on from that, I don't think things have improved drastically in the funding world, but it has moved along. And I think to the first point, you know, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm going to kind of look at, you know, the future of the grant industry and what funders look for in applicants and how to make applications stand out and how to plan for funding. So I'll cover those 4 things. But to my first point about the future of grant making, I think the thing that has happened over the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years is that there's more scrutiny on grant making than there ever has been before. There's been a huge number of books from the likes of Edgar Villanueva. There was Meg Massey's Letting Go, Darren Walker's I think it was Gospel of Giving. Gemma Ball came out with Modern Grant Making recently with Tom Steinberg, Rob Reich. There's been a selection of books, blogs and other things that are really putting funders to notice more so than ever. As I said, when I came into this in 2009, I didn't know what grant making as a profession was. I didn't know that the world of trusts and foundations really existed. Pretty much my experience of funding from the outside was lottery, comic relief and children in need, because they were high profile things that were related to stuff that I saw on television. But in terms of this world where there are actually now, I think 12,000 registered charitable trusts across the country, this is a massive industry. And how massive is this as an industry? We know that the top 300 foundations in this country are worth around £70 billion, and they give away something in the region of about £3 billion per year. It's estimated that the industry, in terms of the other charitable trusts and foundations, are giving away something in the region of between 6 to 10 billion pounds a year. So this is a massive, massive industry, and where you suddenly start to realize that there probably is a significant amount of money that is available to people out there, but it's very much around having the time to be able to source all of these different funders, from the really small ones and the very local ones, right the way through to the more famous ones that we're really aware of. But that's just to give you an idea of the level and scale that we're talking about here, and also just to provide a little bit of encouragement to say that actually there are probably way more options out there than you perhaps realize, but because there isn't really many central places to be able to source this, it's really difficult to get to that. So I think what we've seen recently is, because there's been greater scrutiny, we're starting to see higher levels and layers of accountability from funders. So you have things like, I don't know if you guys know about 360 Giving, but 360 Giving has this thing called GrantNav. I think it's called GrantNav. And GrantNav basically tracks the transparency of all grants made from a number of different trusts and foundations. So if you go on to that, and it doesn't have every trust and foundation on the planet, but if you do some searches on that and have a play around on that, you will actually find, you know, like, for example, if you're looking at bereavement, you could probably go on to do a search on GrantNav around, say, Esme Fairbairn and bereavement, and on that search see how much they've funded in that area before, to understand a bit more about the profile of Esme as a funder in that region. And they've got tons more other funders in there, but you could probably do searches in there. Sorry, it's a bit time consuming, but you know, it's also weirdly quite fun as well. But it just enables you to start to source some of the people that you're thinking about applying to, really starting to do some quite specific searches on GrantNav to find out whether they have a tradition of funding the work that you do, the scale in which they fund it, what type of things they've funded. You can get some of that information on GrantNav that can be quite useful as a way of searching that out. And just as another tip, there was, and I don't know if it still exists, but there was an organization called Beehive that was out as well. And Beehive was meant to be another one-stop place where you could do searches to really locate who you should be targeting for funding and stuff. So I don't know whether that still exists or not, but it was a website where you could sort of put in some of your organizational details, and that would enable you to be able to start to identify specific funders that you could apply to under your criteria. I know there's one in the States called Flux that's not over here, where people can do a similar things, but yeah, Beehive is another one. But I think my point here is that as a result of this, what you're starting to see is funders being a bit more transparent, and the more transparent they are, the less abstract. For me, what was always difficult is that whenever I would spend, I don't know, an evening when I was delivering programs looking at funders, and it was often because I was trying to find ways to replace my wages, I was like, I type it in and everything just looked and sounded the same. And when I would go to these sort of funding fairs, most of the people that were there would say very similar things, and I wouldn't really understand whether I could apply to them or not, because everyone was saying, I don't know, we want a fairer future and we want, an equitable future. And it's like, great, but can I apply for my particular program? So it was very difficult to unpick that. So the fact that we're seeing greater scrutiny means that I think funders are becoming slightly more transparent and a bit more specific about what they are funding. And I think that's going to be more positive. And I think it also means that this kind of hidden world is starting to change. I would also say that, I work with a number of partners on the 2027 campaign. And certainly when I worked at the lottery as well, we were hiring more practitioners or people with lived experience to be grants managers, which meant that the relationships between those that were funding and those that were seeking funding was starting to change as well. Again, very slow, but I do think that the proximity is reducing, and I think the transparency is a bit better than it was. So there are some changes there. But I would always say that there's a lot more to learn, and where funders tend to be very, very slow is the fact that during COVID-19, obviously that exacerbated a huge levels of existing disparities that existed in our society. And the thing that always struck me is that a lot of the funders ended up being really reactive and responsive to it, but they could have taken a front foot a lot earlier. So we've had a ton of reports, in particular, I think about the civil society inquiry that was run by Julia Unwin, which I think was published in 2018, which really flagged a lot of these things that were exacerbated in COVID-19 about where philanthropists can really make a huge change. So making the changes around transparency and their proximity towards community. So you're also, while things are changing, we also know that funders still tend to be quite slow on the uptake in terms of really being able to change themselves and stuff. So that's where we're going. As I said, positive steps towards the future, but again, very, very slow. In terms of what funders look for in applicants, as I said, we used to, it's still a bit of an industry in terms of funding. So when we were at the lottery, when I was at the lottery, we disbanded sort of written applications, and we used to just do verbal applications. And when I say verbal applications, it meant that a lot of my team would go out and do outreach, and we had teams across the country that would be able to do that and base things more on conversation and less on paperwork. But then what was often difficult is that even though they were having conversations, they were still applying very much a transactional sort of desktop-based way of doing things to that particular approach. But I think there is a move, and has been a move, to a more relational approach. It seems that more funders are open to people being able to pick up the phone, to call them and have those conversations. So I think that for me is really, really positive in terms of building relationships. Again, if I go back 10 years, everything was really transactional, and everything tended to be, you sat behind a desk, application came in, you administered it, and then it was gone. I think if there are opportunities to really have conversations with your grants officer, to ask them questions about other funders in the field or what they see as the landscape, I would really, really take that opportunity to cultivate that relationship. What I've always found is that grants officers are absolutely, if you find good grants officers, they're absolutely golden. Why are they golden? One, normally because they are closer to the social issue than a lot of the decision makers in their organization, but also they're getting applications in from everywhere. So in terms of the person that has a helicopter view of everything that's going on, in terms of the relationship with them, it's not just about your relationship to your grant with that officer. It's also about what they might know about other funders that are local, other funders that are in the realms that you're in terms of, be it dementia, be it mentoring, be it bereavement. They will know other colleagues that they can tap into and stuff. I think cultivating those relationships is absolutely really essential. And I think that even before I come to what funders look for in applicants, I always come back to just developing those relationships, and whatever spare time that you have, just picking up the phone and speaking to people and having those conversations and enabling that to open doors to conversations. It will seem, and I will say this, that this was probably my mistake, that I was so far, I was just delivering all of the time that I just didn't see the value of doing that. So I just didn't do it. I didn't understand the importance of a 15-minute call or a 10-minute call to someone, because I just didn't see it as part of my job description. My job description was, I'm working with young people and I've got to work with 25 young people on this given evening. That's my job. If I had known now what I know then, which is, Derek, pick up the phone, try and cultivate that relationship, speak to people, and that is a fundamental part of the job. Even if you cannot, equate it at the end of the day, it's not the same as delivering a program and knowing that you've helped someone. It's not on the same scale, but actually I think these things are really important. What funders look for, I think, obviously there's been a really huge move towards, in recent years, more asset-based approaches. So I think where the language is approaching issues not from a deficit model but from an asset-based model, has been a real move in terms of framing applications. So I think it was often the case where people would open applications back in the day with here are all of the problems. Often now you find a lot of funders are really interested to find out around a framing that really looks at the value that exists in communities and some of the solutions to those problems. And it doesn't mean that you ignore the issues, but it really starts to appreciate what the assets are in the work that you're doing, as opposed to just the deficits that's recognized. I think in recent years, certainly over the last 4 to 5 years, there is a huge recognition around the value of lived experience and ensuring that, organizations that are delivering the work are either led, governed, or has heavy involvement of those that are most impacted by the issue that you are working on. So I think being able to demonstrate that is really important. It's still lingering a bit like a bad smell, but impact. And when I say lingering like a bad smell, I think very much through the kind of Blair years right the way through to certainly the last 10 to 15 years, there's just been this huge emphasis on impact, and we've had an influx of people that have come from the private sector that have come in with that language into the charitable sector. That hasn't gone. There is still a huge emphasis on that, even when organizations say that we're not emphasizing it that much. But I think where you can be a bit brave is the bit around defining what impact means for you and not enabling funders to dictate what impact really looks like. And what I mean by that is this, and again, I'll use youth work as an example of this. When I was a youth worker, that impact measurement stuff started to really come in to play, which meant that I would be doing sessions in a youth centre, and we would have the local council that would come in, for example, and say, Derek, here's your framework, here's what you're measuring, here's the outcomes for young people. You need to get X amount into employment, X amount into this, and X amount into that. And the thing that you realize that was really wrong about it, other than the fact that one, it was really rigid, and two, you know, even though we might have been doing good work, in order to get some of those outcomes, we needed to work in partnership with others to be able to achieve those outcomes. The reality was, what we were really good at in terms of our impact was cultivating sustainable relationships with young people. Our impact in part of the ecosystem was really recognizing, and we weren't brave enough to do this at the time, which is to go back to funders and essentially say, no, our impact is not the employment. Our impact is we are able to retain young people into our services better than other local services that they've been involved in. That will give them the impetus to not only find a job, but to be able to stay in a job much longer as a result. Because getting kids into jobs, you could get young people into jobs, doesn't mean that they were ever happy, doesn't necessarily mean that they would stay in the job for any length of time, but we would have ticked our boxes and moved on. So I think there's that piece around really valuing the impact of your work on your own terms, and as best possible being brave to be able to go back to funders and say, actually, you know what, here are the 2 or 3, and you guys will know this, the nuggets of what makes your program really, really either successful or impactful, and really being able to frame things on the basis of this is what we do really, really well. So to look at that. So that's where I talk about impact. Funders are still very much on the new and shiny. So, you know, I would love for all funders to turn around and just say, you know what, we're just going to fund core costs or give unrestricted funding. But, you know, I still think we're in an industry where it's still project funding and still looking for the new and shiny. But again, where you cultivate relationship with grants officers is where you have that conversation before you put in the application to say, look, to be totally honest, I need money for an administrator. I need 20% of my wages paid for. What do you think is the possibility of me being able to apply for that? Because that's what I really need. I really don't need to be starting something new or fishing for that. So again, that's where relationships can really help and enable you to be braver with those applications. And then I always say the bit around partnerships is also stuff that funders really look for. If you are being pushed into levels of trying to achieve these massive impacts that is beyond your organization, again, I come back to the value of the impact that you're having, not overstating what you do, because ultimately, as I said, the most effective thing you could be doing is building those relationships and retaining people in your services. And that's more than good enough. But sometimes a lot of organizations can get pulled into impacts that are outside of their capabilities and stuff. If that's happening, then I think really being able to look at your collaborations and partnerships to ensure that, you know, the funder understands what part you play in that kind of ecosystem of change for your clients is really important. In terms of things that stand out, and again, I'm going to say this more from a personal basis beyond on the other side, so I'm not going to say this as a golden rule because loads of funders are different. I always like people that were just really direct, so they were just really clear about what their purpose was, the importance and scale of the issue that they're addressing, how they help, you know. So I'll be honest with you, I wasn't hugely fussed about things like theories of change and jargon. you know, when I worked at the lottery for a few years, it took me about 6 to 8 months to understand what anyone was talking to me about, because I just didn't understand the language. And I remember at one point, we used to produce like massive 100-page papers for our trustees for our decision-making meetings and stuff. And we used to hate writing those papers, essentially, because it was just written in a certain way that was almost impenetrable. And then we did a workshop with our decision makers, and they revealed to us that they hated reading it because they couldn't understand it either. So there is this language that exists in this kind of industry of it. But don't fall. I would just say don't fall for it. Just be very direct and plain, and try and. I mean, I would say that maybe, you know, there's going to be organisations maybe like the lottery or maybe like ESF funding that you just have to play that game. But just from a personal level, if I couldn't understand it, then I just found it really difficult to, you know, make a clear assessment about it. I think. You know, yeah, as I said, also how are the most people that are most impacted involved in your work, and also having outcomes for your work as well is really important. You know, I always think that, you know, really defining your approach. So the character of your organization is really important. If you want something that really makes you stand out, it's really about, you know, what you see as the true character traits of your organization, and really being able to express how that influences your approach. As I said, avoid jargon. Can a 13-year-old understand it? That's normally a good gauge. You know, understanding what your strengths are, so not just your approach and character, but your value add. Honesty, and again, you know, I'll bow down to you guys in terms of how you approach that. But, you know, if you need core costs, then you need to apply for what you really need, and not sell yourself short on stuff, but build the relationships first to know how far you can push that with an individual funder. Income diversification, you know, no single funder is going to can or will pay for anything. So they often like to see where risk is being shared, and how you can diversify that between, you know, charitable trusts and foundations, public bodies, corporate funders, pro bono support from local businesses, as well as high net worth individuals and individual donors, you know, really having a nice spread of that. And then, of course, track record, your experience, expertise, impact, board members, people that are involved in your organizations are all really good traits. And then just very quickly, just a few really quick tips for how to plan for funding. You know, I guess you guys will probably all know this, but I'll blitz through this very quickly. So one, the first thing that you tend to do is identification. So who are you approaching? Trusts, public body, donors, you know, who are the sources of income that are interested in your work and has got a track record of funding your type of work. You know, have a look at how much they give, whether they're interested in your subject area and their history of giving in your particular area, and your ability to access them as well, and build a pipeline of organizations and funders and donors that you can approach. So, you know, it's really valuable spending, you know, time at the beginning of the year to sort of identify a huge list of those. Second point is sort of cultivation, which is around what I said before, developing relationships, and, you know, don't bombard them with calls every week, right? But, you know, just on occasion, just really taking a point that, you know, send people articles that's relevant, invite them to events, you know, do whatever you can to help them understand your work, offer some access to them as to your expertise, because funders are always doing consultations. So if they know that they can pick up the phone to you guys and know that you will have someone with lived experience that could do a roundtable that they're hosting and stuff, that's always sort of fantastic. So cultivate those relationships. Third bit, solicitation. So really being clear about what you want to achieve, what it will cost, and being honest about that, and what you need to be successful, and being confident around being able to apply for what you really need. And again, the relationships really help with you being able to do that. 4, recognition. So if you are funded, again, the relationship management, pick up the phone, thank people. You know, it's the first part of the journey in relationship with people. There are people that I funded at Esme Fairbairn in 2009 that I ended up funding at the National Lottery in 2019 or 2018, 10 years later, because there were people that I held relationships with for a 10-year period. You don't know where people are going to go to. You don't know where they, you know, where a grant that you do for them is, you know, help them elevate their career as a grant maker and stuff. But keep cultivating those relationships, and make sure that it's not just with one single person within an organization, because you want to carry the individual relationship, but try and do that with others in the organization. Also enables you to tell them when there's problems, you know, and when you can say, look, we've got a problem, you know, because more often than not, I have not met many grants officers that when someone has said there's a crisis and you've gone to them really quickly, that they've pulled the rug from underneath you. They've actually, most grants officers I've worked with have been really super supportive in being able to help that, as long as there's an honest relationship. And then the final bit, stewardship, which is around, you know, just making sure that you report on time, telling them what you've achieved, be honest about some of the mistakes that have been made, but make those grants officers feel like an insider in terms of your work, and ask for their advice. As I said, grants officers will often have a huge overview of what's really going on. So being able to bring them on as part of the journey is really fantastic. So yeah, that's me. Sorry, I talked for way longer than I was meant to, but I wanted to get through all of the stuff.
Oh,
sorry, Connor.
thanks very much, Derek. That's amazing. I feel like I was nodding away and smiling because, yeah, it was very relatable to my very brief experience so far as well. But thank you. And has anyone here got any questions based off of that? Any things they want to clarify? Since there's only 3 of you guys on here, you have plenty of scope to do that. So, Elizabeth, have you got something?
You know what? I'm struggling with the voice, sorry. I'm interested in terms of relationship building. We're working in counselling with children and young people, so people can't come and see what we're doing. And I know that's something I've had many conversations with Co-op about as well, because people want to come and see what we're doing, but it's just not possible ethically to do that. How do you kind of get around that in terms of the relationship building? Because we've had grants which have been declined on that basis, that they can't come and see it. So have you got any suggestions or thoughts around that?
Yeah, like it would have to be you and not the service, and because there's no way that you can compromise that. You know, you can't compromise that, absolutely. So if people are turning you down as a result of that, then they're not the right funder for you, right? That's on them. But I would absolutely, if there is any way that you can do in a very safe way of bringing those grants officers as insiders into your work without violating the privacy of the work that you do, I would try to do that. And that might be where you're doing sort of hosting roundtables and stuff, where there is a safe space to be able to share and provide some insights. I think there are different things that you can do. As I said, I'd be reluctant to be adding on more services and stuff to be able to do that, but it might be the case where, you know, twice a year, you might invite a cluster of funders to a round table that gives a bit of an insight into the work that you do. And you might do one, and there might not be a lot of funders that turn up. You do one or two more just to see whether more and more turn up. and you might abandon it, or you might be cultivating some additional relationships as a result. But if you can bring people into your work as much as possible in a way that is cost effective, doesn't really add on to your workload, but actually where the gains of maybe being able to put on an online evening or something like that, that enables you to attract some of those funders to the work that you're doing without violating the privacy of the people that you're working with, I think are always useful things to do. And as I said, I think sending articles that have been written about your organization or other policy developments that's related to how your organization is addressing some of those policy developments, they're all kind of, you know, as I said, if you can ever find, you know, a couple of hours during the course of the week or whatever it is that's strictly dedicated towards some of that relationship management side of things, it might seem invaluable when you're doing it, but it really is quite valuable in terms of cultivating those relationships in a different way.
Yeah, that's given me some, I've scribbled down thought process whilst we're talking, because that's sort of given me some thoughts of where I might go with that. Thank you.
No worries.
Yeah, I just had a 12-month wait from the lottery for Reaching Communities, £65,000 for a 3-year project supporting 140 carers. The funding, Derek, thank you. It's been the best hour I've spent in a long time at this kind of subject area. And if every funding officer or funding manager were like you, understanding us as grassroots organisations, the very real struggles that we have, and the support and the way that you've spoken today, I think it would greatly help us to achieve more and more for many more people in communities. But they're not all like you, and at the moment it's more of a struggle than ever. And as ESF goes and fades out, it is obviously a concern for us as to what central government do long term. Shared prosperity, obviously, we know won't be ring fenced with the whole amount of funding that ESF brought in to us in times gone by. My contract that I told you about, which was ESF and lotteries, 10 staff members, and we've been able to grow from that because other organisations haven't done so well. And I'm talking biggies, and we're a young baby organisation, really. We've grown dramatically from doing what we've said we will do and some. And I think we've peaked because this contract finishes next year, and we've got 10 frontline staff and 3 part-timers on it. So it is a concern about what happens in the future. And the other concern is, you know, a lot of what we do, it is those hard outcomes around employment, training and education, but we'll support people for 2 to 3 years. So that journey does so much more than just that hard set outcome that gets looked at the end, so much more, you know, from homelessness to changing lives around people's thought processes and feelings about themselves. I loved what you've told me today, and I've wrote a lot of notes out and really enjoyed it. I could have done with some of that 12 months ago because I didn't have a great over the phone relationship with my lottery grant officer, John. And really over the last 12 months, most of it has been on email. And I think what does make a difference is when you get someone on the phone. But I am not somebody that would want to just phone him out the blue and bug. Like you said, don't call them weekly. We spoke about 3 times over the duration of 12 months. And it was very brief because I could tell he wanted to keep it brief. So I wasn't going to going to do anything other than that. But what I think matters the most is when you have a project with someone and it's a success, and then next time they already know about you, as in going in with that one. So for example, I mentioned Heart of England, Elizabeth and Joanne, you'll know of them already probably. Heart of England Community Foundation, we've done quite a lot with them in the past. So when it lands on their inbox that there's an application in from that organisation, they already know you're pretty good. Because I remember from last time you delivered, the stewardship that you mentioned, the governance, the accountability, and that relationship is already there. What I think the lottery ended up really liking from this was about our shared experience and share how we will share with others. So that was the final document. They asked me for an evaluation document, and it was a unanimous decision. I got the call last Friday that we'd been accepted, but the final document you wanted me to provide was about how we'd evaluate the project at the end. But I did a paragraph about how we will share with others during the 3 years. So I said to him, if you got, because it's a digital exclusion project for 3 years, for carers, specifically for carers in one borough, and carers have been massively pushed back due to the pandemic and have lost so many people that were caring for, that's left them without a goal or a purpose in life themselves. But it's got a digital exclusion angle, which obviously is a bit of a biggie at the moment, isn't it? Digitally exclusion angle. And I wrote the paragraph in about how we will share with others nationally this project, but also gain experience from them, and if there's new projects that want to set up, then they could come and visit, or we'll do Teams and Zoom meetings. And he said the lottery really liked that, and it was a unanimous yes, but it should be really for 65,000 for 3 years, because the project will be phenomenal for people. It was started through the pandemic, and I've paid out interim payments to keep the staff member going, waiting for this. I didn't expect it to be for so long, and it was getting touch and go as to whether or not I'd make a redundancy. Obviously what they always want is something different, like you spoke about, and that is difficult when we know we're doing a good job and we've got low reserves, really low reserves, and they always want something different, and that is a challenge from the lottery. I've already looked at 360 Giving. I didn't know about it, so thank you. I looked at it while we were talking about it at the same time. Some really good stuff on there. But what is difficult is that there's no actual grant finder specifically, because there's so many different places to go.
Yeah.
360 seemed very much about projects that have been successful, that you could draw experiences from.
Yeah, absolutely. You're completely right. Sorry, I'm just looking because just to see some resources. So Fit for Funding,
Okay.
I think, is another one that you could go to.
Okay.
The Institute of Fundraising, you could look at. I think there's a website called Trust Funding.
Yeah.
Funding Central.
Blimey, there's a lot more than I thought then. Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
And I think there's also one called Company Giving that you could go to as well. And I've done GrantNav, haven't I, for general. So those are some. Sorry, I'm just looking.
Some of those you have to pay to access, though. I think.
Do you?
Central Giving,
apologies.
I think you have to have a subscription to. That's.
That might be right, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Apologies. I'm just looking around at various.
I think what you've given me today is some really, really good tips that I haven't thought about in previous grants. So how are people most involved, most impacted? Less emphasis on the impact. I think I do too much of that for sure, but also the lived experience and the sharing. Developing relationships with most people comes quite easy, doesn't it? But actually, probably with this lottery guy, I could have picked up the phone a couple of times, because sometimes he left it 3 or 4 months before even emailing me something, and then asking questions that I thought could have been done months before. Whereas if I think
it matters who you get. We had the absolute opposite with our lottery contact. She was ringing up she rang one of our trustees 6 p.m. on a Friday night saying, I couldn't leave this for the weekend. You've got to know that you've had the award. It was that. She was so desperate to be in contact with us all the way through.
Yeah, so you have to gauge it. So I mean, I'm speaking quite generically. You guys have to gauge it depending on the relationship. But if it's not a call, then, as I said, it might be an email about something that's relevant to your work, or something that enables that to happen. It's really funny, because on the flip side, someone would send me like loads of material, and I would be like, I wouldn't necessarily look at it. And then someone would ask me a question about something like 3 or 4 months later, and then I'd be scurrying and looking for that email from the person. You never know when that information or that relationship becomes relevant. But suddenly, this happens all of the time in funding, where there is an emphasis, a change of trustee, and a trustee has a particular interest, for example, in dementia. And then suddenly that trustee sort of says, oh, you should ask about it. And so suddenly everyone starts scurrying for as much information as possible. And the easiest way of getting that information is not Googling. It's actually, oh, I know Joanne. Let me speak to Joanne and have that conversation. So this stuff just becomes really relevant. And it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be the case that you guys are putting yourself up to cultivate these relationships, but it just becomes very, very handy going forward. And sorry, Kate, I was just going to say just a couple of things with, you know, what happens with ESF. You know, at some point in terms of income diversification, you will probably start looking at, you know, maybe some more charitable trusts and foundations. When you start doing that, make sure that you do not frame any funding you're applying to them for as a replacement or a transition from ESF funding or lottery funding, because they tend to run away. And this is generic, so I'm not saying everyone does this, but they tend to run away. They tend to look at the lottery and ESF funding like they would look at funding from a public body, which is, okay, that's clearly more statutory provision than it is stuff that a charitable trust would normally fund. And now they want replacement funding for it. So just be careful about how you frame it. And then also just with trusts and foundations generally, they are slightly more narrative driven than they are impact driven. So in terms of, you know, how you frame it, it's going to be slightly more heart and soul with trusts and foundations. And I know that you know this already, but I'm just, you know, saying it obvious. You know, then it will be sort of more lottery where things are kind of in boxes, as it were. So just in terms of the framing, just a couple of things to think about in that transition.
Yeah, sure. I did get a call. I was speaking to somebody the other day from a housing association that said that in the lottery or the government and lottery white paper, they are talking about more the employability kind of work going down to grassroots organisations, as opposed to some of these biggies that take huge contracts and then they don't do them and they rely on us. So I'm having meetings with national welfare to work providers that are asking us how many tens of hundreds of referrals they can send our way, and they're not paying us for it. And I think that the penny's beginning to drop, and they are thinking now about the grassroots organisations that exist and how much value we add. So hopefully that will be the case.
And it's certainly the case where the level of government contracting is not sustainable for those large organisations. So they will. So I think that the bad thing about it is that they will be looking at ways to deliver services cheaper and cheaper, or they'll be looking to take over smaller organizations to facilitate some of that. I think the bonus will be that organizations that are really close to their communities and can demonstrate that will potentially be a more cost-effective way they will feel of being able to resource this sort of stuff. There's just not going to be as much government funding for these big contracts as there was before. So I think there are opportunities, but, you know, also just be wary that you're not sort of trying to deliver, you know, £1 million worth of work with £200,000.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the other thing is the government will be payment by results led, and I can't run an organisation that way. So, and it's not how I want to. It's not the reason I set up JST 10 years ago. It's not how we work. But I think that's why these multi-million-pound organisations will potentially continue. But they want to, well, that they will continue, but they'll use the third sector because they know that we don't tend to turn people away by any stretch. You know, we are here to support those that are very, very much already pushed back and furthest from anything. You know, getting on the bus is a challenge, let alone starting a full-time job. And this relationship that we have is very different to the relationship that they can have. You know, we're talking long-term changes here. But you know, the Sercos and the likes of this world, they know they need us. And they want to use us effectively, but it's we've got to make sure it's right for us as well.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say to this, and I think this is relevant to everyone, is that one, this is really tough. It's just a tough thing to do. So just one, look out for your well-being and care. So you know, whatever it is that you need to be the leaders that you are and do the work that you do, don't do it at the expense of your well-being. And some of that is going to be around speaking to other CEOs, and just making time to go to dinner with other CEOs or connect with them. You know, it's difficult to do that within your organizations at times. I can imagine that it is very lonely at times doing the work that you do, even though you might be really surrounded by lots of people and all of that. It can be really, really lonely. So having other peer groups that you can speak to, some of the things that at the end of the month or at a different point, you can sort of say, I'm really going to look forward to that. You know why? Because Elizabeth will get it, right? She might not know my area of work, but she will get what it means to be trying to fundraise and being alone in doing this. So even if you're cultivating some of those informal networks, and there'll be other people that will turn around and say, you know what, go to a spa for a day or whatever, go for a massage or whatever. And we in the third sector always look at these things as indulgences. And it's like, it's not, because if you guys are not looking after your well-being, then your organizations will not be able to thrive and do the work that you do. So, you know, beyond this fundraising thing that I'm talking about, the bit around well-being and your connections to other people really is fundamental, and I think that's the stuff that brings a lot of joy. And then also, again, when you are thinking about your organization, when you've got some headspace, think about your purpose and think about what you need to be in terms of either resource, scale, size, whatever it is that enables you to fulfill your purpose and stuff. So you've just got, I guess, those parameters around what type of funds that you will take and what type of funds that you want. So Elizabeth said it the best when she was talking about her parameters and stuff. And, you know, at the end of the day, she's got clear parameters in terms of what she will give insight to in terms of other funders and stuff. And I think it's really, if you're a purpose-driven organization, that piece around what is it that I really need in 5 years' time or 10 years' time that I really need, you know, to be operating really well. Where are my red lines? I think the combination of that purpose-driven idea and what you want and need to be, as well as the piece around looking out for your well-being and connecting with others that's in a similar space, are just two very practical things. And maybe you combine the two, but just two very practical things you can do, because I think if you're doing that, then even those conversations a bit further down the line around the funding side becomes either clearer or easy for you to deal with.
Jo, have you got any questions you want to ask specifically?
Not specifically, but it was an amazing session. Derek, I've got so many hints and tips written down here, and it's just unbelievable. Your advice and your help, it's great. I know you were giving us a general picture, but it's very easy to look at the specifics and think, well, yeah, I can see how that would work. So thank you so much. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you, Joan. That made my day. So thank you.
Okay. Well, if you ever want to go back and listen over anything, clarify anything, then we have a recording that's going to be put on our website, hopefully in the next week or so. So again, thank you, Derek. I mean, you've
No problem.
educated me in the sessions I did with you, and you're spreading the joy and info to everyone else as well. So thank you very much. I'm sure I speak for everyone else when I say that, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Con, and nice to meet you all.
Very
Thanks,
much.
guys.
Thank you so much, Derek. Bye all. Take care.
No
Have a great day.
Bye.